Chapter 7 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Venditti. Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 7. Past the big pine, swerving with a smile at his horse's side, that he might not obliterate the footprint in the black earth, and down the mountain, his brain busy with his big purpose, went John Hale, by instinct, inheritance, blood, and tradition, pioneer. One of his forefathers had been with Washington on the father's first historic expedition into the wilds of Virginia. His great-grandfather had accompanied Boone when that hunter first penetrated the dark and bloody ground, had gone back to Virginia, and come back again with a surveyor's chain and compass, to help wrest it from the red men, among whom there had been an immemorial conflict for possession and a never recognized claim of ownership. That compass and that chain his grandfather had fallen heir to, and with that compass and chain his father had earned his livelihood amid the wrecks of the Civil War. Hale went to the old Transylvania University at Lexington, the first seat of learning planted beyond the Alleghanies. He was fond of history, of the sciences and literature, was unusually adept in Latin and Greek, and had a passion for mathematics. He was graduated with honors. He taught 2 years and got his degree of Master's of Arts. But the pioneer spirit in his blood would still out, and his polite learning he then threw to the winds. Other young Kentuckians had gone west in shoals, but he kept his eye on his own state, and one autumn he added a pick to the old compass and the ancestral chain, struck the old wilderness trail that his grandfather had traveled to look for his own fortune in a land which the old gentleman had passed over as worthless. At the Cumberland River he took a canoe and drifted down the river into the wild, cold-swollen hills. Through the winter he froze, starved, and prospected, and a year later he was opening up a region that became famous after his trust and inexperience had let others worm out of him an interest that would have made him easy for life. With the vision of a seer, he was as innocent as Boone. Stripped clean, he got out his map, such geological reports as he could find, and went into a studious trance for a month, emerging mentally with the freshness of a snake that had shed his skin. What had happened in Pennsylvania must happen all along the great Alleghany chain, in the mountains of Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Alabama, Tennessee. Some day the avalanche must sweep south. It must. That he might be a quarter of a century too soon in his calculations never crossed his mind. Some day it must come. Now there was not an ounce of coal immediately southeast of the Cumberland Mountains, not an ounce of iron ore immediately northeast. All the coal lay to the northeast, all the iron ore to the southeast. So said geology. For 300 miles there were only 4 gaps through that mighty mountain chain, 3 at water level and 1 at historic Cumberland Gap, which was not at water level and would have to be tunneled. So said geography. All railroads to east and to west would have to pass through those gaps. Through them the coal must be brought to the iron ore, or the ore to the coal. Through 3 gaps water flowed between. Ore and coal, and the very hills between were limestone. Was there any such juxtaposition of the 4 raw materials for the making of iron in the known world? When he got that far in his logic, the sweat broke from his brows. He felt dizzy, and he got up and walked into the open air. As the vastness and certainty of the scheme, what fool could not see it, rushed through him full force. He could scarcely get his breath. There must be a town in one of those gaps, but in which? No matter. He would buy all of them, he repeated over and over again. For some day there must be a town in one, and some day a town in all. and from all he would reap his harvest. He optioned those 4 gaps at a low purchase price that was absurd. He went back to the Blue Grass. He went to New York. In some way he managed to get to England. It had never crossed his mind that other eyes could not see what he so clearly saw, and yet everywhere he was pronounced crazy. He failed and his options ran out, but he was undaunted. He picked his choice of the 4 gaps and gave up the other 3. This favorite gap he had just finished optioning again, and now again he meant to keep at his old quest. That gap he was entering now from the north side, and the North Fork of the river was hurrying to enter too. On his left was a great gray rock, projecting edgewise, covered with laurel and rhododendron, and under it was the first big pool from which the stream poured faster still. There had been a terrific convulsion in that gap when the earth was young. The strata had been tossed upright and planted almost vertical for all time, and a little further, one mighty ledge, moss-grown, bush-covered, sentineled with grim pines, their bases unseen, seemed to be making a heavy flight toward the clouds. Big boulders began to pop up in the river bed, and against them the water dashed and whirled and eddied backward in deep pools, while above him the song of a cataract dropped down a tree-choked ravine. Just there the drop came, and for a long space he could see the river lashing rock and cliff with increasing fury, as though it were seeking shelter from some relentless pursuer in the dark thicket where it disappeared. Straight in front of him another ledge lifted itself. Beyond that loomed a mountain which stopped in midair and dropped sheer to the eye. Its crown was bare, and Hale knew that up there was a mountain farm, the refuge of a man who had been involved in that terrible feud beyond Black Mountain behind him. 5 minutes later he was at the yawning mouth of the gap, and there lay before him a beautiful valley shut in tightly, for the eye could see, with mighty hills. It was the heaven-born sight for the unborn city of his dreams, and his eyes swept every curve of the valley lovingly. The 2 forks of the river ran around it. He could follow their course by the trees that lined the banks of each, curving within a stone's throw of each other across the valley, and then looping away from the neck of an ancient lute and, like its framework, coming together again down the valley, where they surged together, slipped through the hills, and sped on with the song of a sweeping river. Up that river could come the track of commerce. Out of the South Fork, too, it could go, though it had to turn eastward back through that gap. It could be traced north and west, and so none could come as heralds into those hills, but their footprints could be traced through that wild, rocky, water-worn chasm. Hale drew breath and raised in his stirrups. "It's a cinch," he said aloud. "It's a shame to take the money." Yet nothing was in sight now but a valley farmhouse above the ford where he must cross the river, and one log cabin on the hill beyond. Still on the other river was the only woolen mill in miles around. Further up was the only grist mill, and near by the only store, the only blacksmith shop, and the only hotel. That much of a start the Gap had had for 3/4 of a century. Only from the south now a railroad was already coming. From the east another was traveling like a wounded snake, and from the north still another creeped to meet them. Every road must run through the Gap, and several had already run through it, lines of survey. The coal was at one end of the Gap and the iron ore at the other. The cliffs between were limestone, and the other elements to make it the iron center of the world flowed through it like a torrent. "Sheila, it's a shame to take the money." He splashed into the creek, and his big black horse thrust his nose into the clear running water. Minnows were playing about him. A hogfish flew for shelter under a rock, and below the ripples a 2-pound bass shot like an arrow into deep water. Above and below him the stream was arched with beech, poplar, and water maple, and the banks were thick with laurel and rhododendron.